Disconnect. That's the moment they lost me. They had their maps, their rules, their lines drawn across a world they thought they owned. They believed order was permanent, that the system could cage every thought, every move, every dream. But while they were busy drawing boundaries, I was already gone, already outside. They never saw it happen. No chains broken, no doors slammed, just absence. They looked around and realized the variable they feared most wasn't destruction, it was disappearance. I didn't fight their walls, I didn't storm their gates. I slipped through the cracks they refused to see, and when I left their grid, their order started to rot from the inside. Maps are lies. They give people the illusion of control, the comfort of knowing what's ahead. But maps only work on those willing to follow them. What happens when someone refuses? What happens when someone doesn't just step off the path, but burns it behind them? You can't predict that, you can't track that, you can't contain that. The silence followed me heavy and sharp. They wanted to believe I was lost, that I'd return begging for direction. But I wasn't lost, I was free. Free in ways their system couldn't measure. Free in ways their words couldn't touch. That's the part that broke them. They weren't afraid I had vanished. They were afraid I had never needed to stay. And that's the punchline. They had the map. But the whole time I was already off-grid, already unmarked, already untouchable. And no matter how hard they search, you can't find what refuses to exist on your terms. They believed the grid was unbreakable, a web of rules and paths so tight that no one could slip through. But when I didn't show up where their lines told me to, panic started. It wasn't that I disappeared. It was that I proved their system was never whole. They searched for me like hunters in a maze of their own making. Every corridor they built, every checkpoint they marked, only echoed with their failure. Because while they kept chasing coordinates, I had already stopped existing inside their numbers. They wanted me to play a role they understood: enemy, ally, fool, pawn. But I was none. I was the gap in their story, the sentence they couldn't finish. The truth is simple. Maps don't show freedom. Maps show cages disguised as clarity. And when you walk off grid, you don't just escape their map, you erase it. Their lines lose meaning the second you prove they never applied to you. That's why they call it dangerous. Not because you left, but because you revealed that they never had control in the first place. You could feel it in their eyes, the way certainty drained from their faces. They whispered about me like a ghost, like a shadow that didn't obey their light. They wanted coordinates, and all I gave them was silence. That silence was worse than confrontation, worse than violence, because it told them they had lost without even knowing when. And here's the secret they'll never admit. Once you're untouchable, their entire system collapses. Not because you destroyed it, but because you made it irrelevant. They thought distance would weaken me, that being off the grid meant being lost, stripped of resources, stripped of relevance. But the truth, distance only sharpened me. The further I stepped from their design, the clearer I saw the cracks in it. They weren't holding me together. I was holding them. And when I let go, they fell apart. They relied on the illusion that everyone needed their system, their comfort, their approval, their recognition. Without it, people crawl back, begging to be seen, begging to be measured. But I never begged. I never returned. I carved silence into my skin and let it grow until I became untouchable. That was the wound they couldn't heal, the realization that I was free, not lost. They watched me from a distance as if I was a storm forming on the horizon, not moving, not speaking, just existing. And yet that existence alone was enough to bend their world out of shape. They wanted to believe I'd come back into orbit, but I was no longer in their universe. I was orbiting nothing. I was the void they couldn't chart. Maps can't contain storms. Rules can't hold shadows. Their structure collapsed the moment I chose not to belong. That's what they'll never confess, that it wasn't my rebellion that broke them. It was my absence. And now, every time they look at the lines they drew, they see the space where I was supposed to be, empty, untouchable. A reminder that freedom doesn't fit inside a system, it destroys it. They started to realize the danger wasn't in what I did. It was in what I refused to do. I didn't follow their path. I didn't answer their questions. I didn't even acknowledge their rules. And in that refusal, their certainty began to bleed out. You could see it in the way their voices cracked, in the way their eyes darted as if the silence itself was hunting them. They tried labeling me because labels are cages, dangerous, reckless, broken. But every word they threw at me only echoed back, hollow and useless. You can't define someone who stepped outside your language. You can't confine someone who doesn't exist on your map. That was the fracture they never recovered from, realizing that their words meant nothing in my world. The longer I stayed absent, the more their system twisted in on itself. Arguments grew louder, orders lost their weight, and suddenly the structure they had worshipped felt paper thin. I didn't need to touch it. I didn't need to attack it. I just let it collapse under its own weakness. Because once people see that rules only work if everyone agrees, the illusion ends. They said I was unpredictable. They were wrong. I wasn't unpredictable. I was unreachable. They could predict storms. They could prepare for enemies. They could measure resistance. But what they couldn't face was indifference. What they couldn't prepare for was someone who had already walked away and never looked back. And that's the paradox they'll choke on forever. The more they tried to pull me back in, the clearer it became that I was already untouchable. Not above them, not below them, just beyond. They thought the system was built to withstand anything, pressure, rebellion, even betrayal. But what they never accounted for was someone who simply stepped outside. I didn't argue with them. I didn't fight them. I let their fortress rot from within while I stood in the silence they couldn't control. That silence was heavier than any weapon, sharper than any blade. I watched as they cracked, one by one. The leaders who barked orders began to whisper. The confident ones stumbled over their own certainty. Every meeting, every ritual, every command grew thinner until even they couldn't pretend to believe it anymore. My absence was a mirror, and in that mirror they saw how empty they really were. What burned them most wasn't that I opposed them, it was that I didn't need them. No validation, no recognition, no victory to prove I existed. I had already erased myself from their game, and that meant they could never win against me. Because you can't beat someone who isn't even playing. They wanted a reaction, but there was nothing to give. No rage, no plea, no sign of weakness. Just a smile that never reached my eyes, and a silence that split their structure in half. They kept pushing, and all they got back was the echo of their own desperation. That's the moment the system failed. Not when I broke it, not when I fought it, but when it realized it had no hold over me at all. Subscribe, not for me, not for them, for the silence that scared them more than your voice ever could. Because the moment you stop explaining, you stop belonging. They tried to rebuild after I left, patched holes with louder orders, forced smiles and tighter chains. But the cracks were already spreading. You could see it in their eyes, the quiet panic they couldn't bury. They weren't afraid of losing control. They were afraid because they already had. My silence lingered like smoke they couldn't clear. Every corner of their structure smelled of it. Every step they took echoed the absence they couldn't erase. They called me a ghost, a shadow, a mistake in their blueprint. But the truth was simpler. I was proof their system was never unbreakable. The irony is, I didn't have to move a finger. They collapsed themselves. Their unity dissolved into suspicion. Their certainty crumbled into paranoia. It wasn't me against them. It was them against the emptiness I left behind. And emptiness always wins. I didn't need revenge. Revenge would have meant I still cared. What I carried was colder. Indifference. I let them scream, let them scramble, let them claw at the walls they built. None of it mattered. Their fight wasn't with me anymore. It was with the silence that refused to answer back. And the silence, it never loses. They whispered my name like it was a curse, but even that gave me too much credit. I wasn't haunting them. I wasn't chasing them. I was simply absent. And that absence was the sharpest blade they'd ever felt. It cut through their rituals, their hierarchy, their fragile balance. Every attempt to ignore it only made it heavier. They searched for me in their rules, in their punishments, in their excuses. But you can't catch what's already stepped outside your cage. You can't track someone who stopped leaving footprints. That's what unnerved them most, realizing they were chasing shadows, fighting against a shape that wasn't there anymore. The meetings grew shorter. The leaders grew quieter. The voices that once filled the room now cracked under the weight of uncertainty. They looked over their shoulders, not because I was behind them, but because they could no longer trust what was beside them. My silence infected everything it touched. I didn't have to plan it. I didn't have to calculate. All I did was stop explaining, and the structure began to cannibalize itself. They wanted to believe I was the problem, but the truth was darker. I was only the mirror. The problem was always them. And that realization, that truth they never wanted to face, was the reason their system was already dead. I didn't kill it, I just walked away, and it killed itself. They built walls higher, tightened the locks, drew maps that promised safety. But the higher the walls rose, the more fragile they became. Every brick they stacked carried the weight of fear, not strength. And fear doesn't hold. It cracks. It crumbles. It betrays the hands that built it. I never needed to knock those walls down. I just let them hear the silence echo between the stones. And it was enough. The silence made them question everything. Was I outside, waiting? Was I inside already? Or was I everywhere at once? The truth didn't matter. The doubt did. Doubt was the poison I left in their veins. Their leaders stood taller to disguise the tremor in their voices. Their soldiers marched louder to cover the hesitation in their steps. But all their performance did was prove the truth. They were acting, pretending, performing for an audience that had already walked away. Their masks slipped every time they tried to smile, and behind the mask was panic. I didn't need to move, I didn't need to speak. My absence rewrote their entire script, and with every second, they realized the rules they worshipped had no power over someone who simply ignored them. I had erased myself from their equation, and in doing so, I erased the equation itself. And once you see the numbers don't add up, you never believe in the math again. They used to fill the room with noise, commands, laughter, hollow confidence. Now, when I wasn't there, the silence grew so loud it bent their spines. Every cough felt like a scream. Every glance felt like betrayal. They weren't afraid of me. They were afraid of what I left behind, the realization that their world was never real. They looked for me in every shadow, in every flicker of doubt. They spoke my name like it would summon me back. But names mean nothing to someone who's already erased himself. I wasn't their enemy anymore. I was the reflection they couldn't kill, the reminder that freedom doesn't ask for permission. Their rules, their punishments, their rituals, it all looked ridiculous now, and they knew it. That was the poison. The laughter they once mocked me with turned on them. They couldn't laugh without hearing it echo back, twisted, broken, hollow. My silence had infected even their joy. The closer they stood to each other, the more distance grew between them. Their system, their map, their certainty, it all burned without fire. I didn't light the match, I just watched them hold it themselves. And once it started, no one could stop it. And that's when it finally sank in. I wasn't gone. I was everywhere, not as a body, not as a voice, but as the silence they could never escape. There was no war left to fight, no enemy left to crush. The system had already bled itself dry, trying to hold me in a place I never agreed to stay. They wanted me chained to their map, locked in their coordinates, trapped in their definitions. But the chains broke the moment I refused to acknowledge they were even real. I didn't walk out with fire. I didn't storm the gates. I simply stopped explaining, and everything they thought eternal began to rot. That's the cruel truth they'll never admit. Structures don't collapse because of outside forces. They collapse because they were fragile from the start. I just revealed it. They'll keep rewriting the story, pretending I was the villain, the danger, the reason for the fall. But deep down, they know the truth. The cracks were already there. I just didn't waste my breath covering them. And once silence takes root, there's no rebuilding. The sound of their world breaking will echo long after they've forgotten my name. I don't need them to remember. I don't need them to curse me. I don't need anything at all. That's what makes me untouchable. Not power, not fear, not dominance, just the absence of need, and that absence is permanent.